ancient lands where time moves like gentle rivers and stories flow like whispered prayers, there lived men whose names would echo through eternity. Let us journey together through the soft twilight of memory, where the foundations of faith were laid stone by sacred stone, and where ordinary men became vessels of the divine will. Long ago, when the world was younger and the voice of God walked more closely with humanity, there lived a man named Abraham. He dwelt in the great city of Ur among the Chaldeans, where towers reached toward heaven and the bustle of commerce filled the streets from dawn to dusk. Yet in the quiet moments between heartbeats, Abraham heard something others could not hear, a calling that stirred his soul like wind across still water. The voice that came to Abraham was gentle yet commanding, like the first light of dawn breaking over distant mountains. "Leave your country," the voice whispered. "Leave your kindred and your father's house, and go to a land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing to all the families of the earth." And so Abraham, whose faith flowed like a deep river, gathered his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, and all their possessions, and they began a journey that would span generations. They traveled through lands where olive trees cast silver shadows and where shepherds watched their flocks under star-filled skies. Each step was an act of trust, each day a testament to faith in promises yet unseen. The land that God showed Abraham was Canaan, a place of rolling hills and fertile valleys, where milk and honey seemed to flow from the very earth itself. Here, beneath ancient oaks and beside flowing streams, Abraham built altars and called upon the name of the Lord. The covenant made with Abraham was like a golden thread woven through time. His descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand upon the seashore. Years passed like seasons changing, and Sarah, though advanced in age, bore Abraham a son named Isaac, the child of promise, born when hope seemed as distant as morning stars, became the living proof of God's faithfulness. Isaac grew in wisdom and stature, and when the time came, he took Rebekah as his wife, a woman whose kindness flowed like water from a well in the desert. Isaac and Rebekah were blessed with twin sons, Jacob and Esau, who even in the womb seemed to wrestle with destiny itself. Esau emerged first, covered with hair like a garment, strong and wild as the creatures of the field. Jacob followed, his hand grasping his brother's heel, as if even from birth he sought to overtake what had been given to another. The years unfolded like scrolls being carefully opened, revealing story after story. Jacob, through cunning and circumstance, received the blessing meant for his firstborn brother. But blessings obtained through deception carry their own weight, and Jacob soon found himself fleeing from Esau's righteous anger, traveling toward his uncle Laban in the land of his mother's people. On the journey, as night fell like a gentle blanket over the wilderness, Jacob lay his head upon a stone and dreamed. In his dream, he saw a ladder stretching from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending upon it in an endless, graceful dance. At the top of the ladder stood the Lord himself, renewing the covenant made with Abraham and Isaac, promising that Jacob too would become the father of nations. Jacob worked for Laban for many years, tending flocks and learning the patient lessons that only time can teach. He married Leah and Rachel, and from these wives and their servants came 12 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. These 12 would become the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel, their names echoing through history like distant thunder. The most beloved of Jacob's sons was Joseph, born to Rachel in her joy after years of longing. Joseph was a dreamer, gifted with visions that came to him like whispers from tomorrow. His brothers grew jealous of their father's favor toward Joseph, and their jealousy festered like a wound that would not heal. In their anger, they sold Joseph to merchants traveling to Egypt, telling their father that wild beasts had torn him apart. But in Egypt, Joseph's gift for interpreting dreams elevated him from slavery to becoming second only to Pharaoh himself. When famine came to the land like a withering breath, it was Joseph's wisdom that saved not only Egypt, but his own family as well. Jacob and all his household came down to Egypt, where they dwelt in the land of Goshen, their flocks multiplying like stars appearing at evening. The years in Egypt passed like water flowing toward the sea, and the children of Israel became numerous and strong. But as generations turned like pages in an ancient book, there arose a new Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. This Pharaoh looked upon the growing multitude of Israelites with fear, seeing in their numbers not the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, but a threat to his own power. Gradually, gently, fear transformed the descendants of Jacob from guests into slaves. Their days became filled with the making of bricks under the burning sun, their nights with dreams of freedom that seemed as distant as the stars. The Egyptians afflicted them with heavy burdens, yet the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and grew. Their cries rose to heaven like incense, carrying the weight of generations of bondage. It was into this world of oppression that Moses was born, arriving at a time when Pharaoh had decreed that every Hebrew male child should be cast into the river Nile. His mother, seeing that he was a beautiful child, hid him for 3 months, weaving around him a cocoon of protection with all the love a mother's heart could hold. When she could hide him no longer, she made a basket of bulrushes, waterproofed it with bitumen and pitch, placed the baby inside, and set it among the reeds by the river's edge. Like a prayer carried on the current, the basket floated gently until it came to where Pharaoh's daughter had come down to bathe. Her heart was moved with compassion when she saw the crying child, and though she knew he was one of the Hebrew children, she chose mercy over fear. Through divine providence working through human kindness, Moses was raised in Pharaoh's own household, learning the wisdom of Egypt while never forgetting the blood that flowed in his veins. Moses grew to manhood in the corridors of power, educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, yet his heart remained tender toward his people's suffering. One day, when he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, righteous anger flared within him like fire, and he struck down the oppressor. The next day, finding 2 Hebrews fighting, He tried to make peace between them, but they rejected his intervention, asking, "Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Realizing his deed was known, Moses fled from Pharaoh's wrath into the wilderness of Midian. There, by a well where shepherds brought their flocks to drink, he met the daughters of Jethro, the priest of Midian. When other shepherds drove them away, Moses defended them with the same passion for justice that had led him into exile. This act of kindness led to his marriage to Zipporah, one of Jethro's daughters. And for 40 years, Moses lived as a shepherd in the wilderness, learning patience from the sheep and humility from the vast, silent spaces of the desert. The wilderness years shaped Moses like wind-shaped stone, slowly but surely. His hands, once soft from palace life, became weathered from tending flocks. His feet learned the secret paths between the rocks, and his eyes grew accustomed to reading the language of clouds and stars. In the solitude of shepherding, his soul found the deep quiet that would later allow him to hear the voice of the Almighty with perfect clarity. One day, as Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law near Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, he noticed something extraordinary. In the distance, a bush burned with flames that danced like liquid gold, yet the bush was not consumed. The fire seemed to feed on some source beyond earthly fuel, burning with a light that was both fierce and gentle, both terrible and beautiful. Drawn by wonder, Moses turned aside to investigate this marvel. As he approached, a voice called to him from within the flames, a voice that seemed to contain multitudes, yet spoke with perfect clarity. "Moses, Moses." And Moses answered with the reverence of one who suddenly understands he stands in the presence of the sacred. "Here I am." "Do not come near," the voice continued, each word carrying weight like drops of precious oil. "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses hid his face in awe and trembling, for he was afraid to look upon God. The voice that spoke from the burning bush carried within it the sound of all human sorrow and all divine compassion. "I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey." The commission that came next fell upon Moses like a mantle he felt unworthy to wear. "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Moses, remembering his earlier failure and his 40 years of obscurity, protested his inadequacy. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" But God's answer came like gentle thunder. "I will be with you, and this shall be the sign that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." When Moses asked for God's name, the response came like a riddle wrapped in mystery. "I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel. I am has sent me to you." The conversation by the burning bush continued as God outlined the great work that lay ahead. Moses would return to Egypt with his brother Aaron as his spokesman, and together they would confront the might of Pharaoh with nothing but faith and the power of the Most High. God warned that Pharaoh's heart would be hardened, that signs and wonders would be necessary to convince him to let the Israelites go. With great reluctance but growing determination, Moses returned to Egypt, where he found his people in even deeper bondage than when he had left. The Israelite elders gathered to hear Moses and Aaron speak the words of the Lord, and when they saw the signs that God had given Moses, his staff turning into a serpent, his hand becoming leprous and then clean again, they believed and bowed their heads in worship, knowing that the God of their fathers had finally heard their cries. The confrontation with Pharaoh began like a gentle stream that would eventually become a mighty river. Moses and Aaron stood before the throne of Egypt's ruler, a man who considered himself divine, and delivered the message from the God of Israel. "Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness." Pharaoh's response came swift and harsh. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." Instead of granting freedom, Pharaoh increased the Israelites' burdens, commanding that they gather their own straw for making bricks while maintaining the same daily quota. The people's suffering intensified, and they turned their frustration upon Moses and Aaron, crying out in their anguish, "May the Lord look upon you and judge, because you have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." But God's plan was unfolding like a flower opening to the sun, each petal revealing new aspects of divine power and mercy. The 10 plagues that would fall upon Egypt were not merely displays of might, but carefully orchestrated demonstrations that the God of Israel was sovereign over all the forces that Egypt worshipped: the Nile River, the sun, the fertility of the land, even life and death themselves. The first plague transformed the sacred Nile River into blood. The water that was the lifeblood of Egypt became undrinkable, and fish died throughout the land. Yet Pharaoh's magicians duplicated this wonder with their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart remained hard as granite. 7 days later, the second plague began as frogs swarmed from the river in countless multitudes. They filled the houses, the bedrooms, the beds, the ovens, and the kneading bowls. The entire land teemed with frogs, their croaking creating a symphony of judgment that echoed from the pyramids to the humblest mud brick house. This time, when Pharaoh begged Moses to remove the plague, promising to let the people go, Moses demonstrated God's precise control by allowing Pharaoh to name the exact time when the frogs would die. But when relief came, Pharaoh's heart hardened once more. The third plague brought forth gnats from the dust of the earth, tiny creatures that tormented both man and beast throughout Egypt. This time, Pharaoh's magicians could not replicate the miracle and declared, "This is the finger of God." Yet Pharaoh would not listen, his pride stronger than his people's suffering. The fourth plague sent swarms of flies throughout Egypt, but in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites dwelt, there were no flies. This distinction marked the beginning of God's clear separation between his people and their oppressors. Again, Pharaoh promised release, and again he broke his word when the flies departed. The 5th plague struck the livestock of Egypt with a severe disease that killed cattle, horses, donkeys, camels, oxen, and sheep. Yet not one animal belonging to the Israelites died. The invisible line between God's judgment and God's protection became as clear as the difference between night and day. The 6th plague brought painful boils upon all the people and animals of Egypt. The magicians could not even stand before Moses because of the boils that covered their bodies. Yet still Pharaoh's heart remained unmoved, hardened beyond the reach of reason or compassion. The 7th plague unleashed hail unlike any that had ever fallen in Egypt. Fire mixed with the hail, and it struck down everything in the fields, man, beast, and plant alike. Only in Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was there no hail. This time Pharaoh's confession came with apparent sincerity. I have sinned this time. The Lord is righteous, and I and my people are wicked. But when the hail ceased, his heart hardened once more. The 8th plague brought locusts in such numbers that they covered the face of the earth like a living carpet of destruction. They ate every plant that the hail had left, stripping the land bare until nothing green remained. Pharaoh's own servants begged him to let the Israelites go before Egypt was completely destroyed. But even in the face of total agricultural ruin, Pharaoh's pride held firm. The 9th plague was darkness, not merely the absence of light, but a darkness so thick it could be felt, a darkness that pressed upon the soul like the weight of despair. For 3 days, no one in Egypt could see another person or rise from their place. Yet all the Israelites had light in their dwellings. This supernatural darkness was a preview of the final judgment to come, a shadow cast by the approaching angel of death. Each plague had been an invitation to repentance, a divine tap on the shoulder growing progressively firmer. Now came the final warning, delivered with the solemnity of one announcing the end of an age. The firstborn of Egypt would die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the maidservant behind the millstone, and all the firstborn of the livestock. The cry that would rise from Egypt would be unlike any that had ever been heard or would ever be heard again. But for the children of Israel, this night of judgment would become a night of salvation, the birth of a nation through the blood of a lamb. God instructed each Israelite family to select a lamb without blemish and to keep it until the 14th day of the month. Then, at twilight, they were to slaughter the lamb and take some of its blood to mark the doorposts and lintel of their houses. The lamb was to be roasted with fire and eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, consumed in haste with their loins girded, sandals on their feet, and staff in hand, the posture of those ready for a journey. Nothing of the lamb was to remain until morning. What could not be eaten was to be burned with fire. This meal would become the Passover, a memorial feast to be observed throughout their generations as a lasting ordinance. When I see the blood, God declared, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. The blood of the lamb became a covering, a protection painted in crimson across the thresholds of faith. It was a sign visible to heaven, marking the difference between those who trusted in God's word and those who trusted in their own power. At midnight on that solemn night, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. The wailing that rose from Egypt was like a river of sorrow flowing through the darkness. It was the sound of pride finally broken, of power finally humbled, of a nation learning too late that there are forces in the universe that cannot be bargained with, manipulated, or overcome by human strength alone. The grief was universal, from the palace of Pharaoh to the humblest dwelling, from the houses of the mighty to the quarters of servants. Death had visited with democratic impartiality. In the midst of this national mourning, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the darkness of that dreadful night. His words came broken and hurried, spoken by a man who had finally learned the difference between earthly authority and divine power. Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel. Go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds and be gone, and bless me also. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the land, for they said, we shall all be dead. After 400 years of bondage, freedom came suddenly, like dawn breaking after the longest night in history. The Israelites went out with their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. They asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so they granted their requests. Thus Israel plundered the Egyptians, taking with them not only their freedom, but also the wealth that would fund their wilderness journey and the building of God's tabernacle. About 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children, went up out of Egypt, along with a mixed multitude of others who chose to join them in their exodus. They also took large herds of livestock, carrying with them all the accumulated wealth of their bondage years. The route God chose for them was not the direct path through Philistine territory, which would have been shorter, but fraught with the danger of war. Instead, God led them by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. The people of Israel went up armed out of Egypt, and Moses took with him the bones of Joseph, fulfilling the ancient oath that the children of Israel had sworn. God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here. Then, by day, the Lord went before them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so they could travel day and night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night never left their sight, a constant visible reminder that their God was with them, leading them step by step toward their promised destination. But Pharaoh's change of heart came as quickly as it had the night death visited his palace. When it was told him that the people had fled, his mind and the mind of his servants changed toward the people of Israel. "What have we done?" they asked. "We have let Israel go from serving us." The economic reality of losing an entire workforce began to sink in, and with it came the desire to reclaim what had been lost. Pharaoh made ready his chariot and took his army with him, 600 chosen chariots, and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. The Egyptian military machine, the most formidable in the ancient world, began its pursuit of the fleeing Israelites. They overtook them encamped by the sea, near Pihahiroth, before Baal-zephon, where God had instructed them to camp. When the Israelites lifted up their eyes and saw the Egyptians marching after them, fear gripped their hearts like icy fingers. They cried out to the Lord, but they also turned their terror into anger against Moses. Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Did we not say to you in Egypt, "Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians"? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Moses' response came with the calm authority of one who had learned to trust completely in God's promises. Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. The Lord spoke to Moses with instructions that seemed impossible by human logic, but simple by divine power. Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. The angel of God who was going before the host of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. Through the night the cloud was darkness to the Egyptians, but gave light to the Israelites, creating a supernatural barrier that prevented the armies from approaching one another. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, making the sea dry land. The waters were divided, creating walls of water on either side of a path that stretched across the seabed. The sight was beyond human comprehension. Towering walls of water held back by invisible hands, creating a highway through the depths of the sea. The people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Each step they took was an act of faith, trusting that the God who had opened this path would sustain it until they reached the other side. Children walked where fish had swum. Elderly shuffled across ground that had never felt sunlight, and the sheep and cattle of Israel traversed the ocean floor as if it were an ordinary field. The Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea. All Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. The pride that had been Pharaoh's downfall now drove his army into the trap that God had prepared. In the morning watch, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud upon the Egyptian forces and threw them into a panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily, and the Egyptians began to understand the truth that was too late to save them. Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. The realization came like lightning in the darkness. They were fighting not against a crowd of fleeing slaves, but against the power that had created the universe. When all the Israelites had safely crossed to the other side, the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when morning appeared. The Egyptians fled before the returning waters, but the Lord threw them into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen Pharaoh's entire army that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them remained. The military might of Egypt, which had seemed invincible just hours before, vanished beneath the waves like a bad dream dissolving in the morning light. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. The people saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, and they feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. The shore was littered with evidence of God's deliverance shields and spears, pieces of chariots, the remains of an army that had thought it could contend with the Almighty. In response to this mighty deliverance, Moses and the people of Israel sang a song to the Lord, their voices rising like incense in the morning air. "I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him." Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and dancing. The celebration was spontaneous and joyful, a people who had been slaves at sunrise dancing in freedom by sunset, their hearts overflowing with gratitude and wonder at what God had done for them. The Exodus was complete, but the journey was just beginning. They were free from Egypt, but they were not yet in the promised land. Before them stretched the wilderness, vast and challenging, where they would learn what it meant to depend completely upon God for their daily bread, their water, their protection, and their guidance. From the Red Sea, they journeyed into the wilderness of Shur, and for 3 days they found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water there because it was bitter. Hence the name Marah, which means bitter. The people grumbled against Moses, asking, "What shall we drink?" Their faith, so strong at the Red Sea, began to waver in the face of practical challenges. But God showed Moses a tree, and when he threw it into the water became sweet and drinkable. It was the first of many lessons they would learn in the wilderness, that God's provision often comes in unexpected forms, and that his solutions may seem strange to human logic, but are always perfectly suited to the need. They journeyed on to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water. It was a place of rest and refreshment, a gentle reminder that even in the wilderness, God prepares places of comfort and renewal for his people. As they continued deeper into the wilderness between Elim and Sinai, in the wilderness of Sin, the whole congregation of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, Their complaints revealed how quickly the human heart can forget miracles. Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. God's response to their grumbling was not anger, but provision. He promised to rain bread from heaven for them, enough for each day, with a double portion on the 6th day, so they could rest on the 7th. This daily bread, which they called manna, meaning, what is it? Would sustain them for 40 years in the wilderness. Each morning, when the dew lifted, there on the face of the wilderness lay a fine, flake-like substance, fine as hoarfrost on the ground. It was white like coriander seed, and its taste was like wafers made with honey. The people were instructed to gather only what they needed for each day, learning to trust God for tomorrow's provision rather than hoarding from fear. Along with manna came quail in the evening, covering the camp so that the people could eat meat. God was teaching them that He could provide not just the necessities of life, but its pleasures as well. They were not merely surviving in the wilderness. They were being sustained by the direct provision of heaven. But perhaps more challenging than hunger was thirst. At Rephidim, there was no water for the people to drink, and once again they quarreled with Moses. "Give us water to drink. Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" Their faith seemed to evaporate as quickly as dew in the desert sun. Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." God's answer was both practical and symbolic. "Strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, that the people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, and water flowed from the rock like a river in the desert. The place was called Massa, meaning testing, and Meribah, meaning quarreling, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" It was a question that would echo through their wilderness years, a question that would be answered not just once, but again and again through God's patient provision and protection. At Rephidim, they also faced their first military challenge as the Amalekites came to fight against Israel. Moses sent Joshua to choose men to go out and fight, while he stood on the top of the hill with the staff of God in his hand. As long as Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, but whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. When Moses' hands grew heavy, Aaron and Hur took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Then they supported his hands, one on each side, so his hands remained steady until the sun went down. It was a beautiful picture of community support and shared responsibility in the work of God. Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the sword, and the Lord declared that he would utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Moses built an altar and called its name, "The Lord is my banner," recognizing that victory had come not through human strength, but through divine intervention. In the 3rd month after the people of Israel had gone out of Egypt, on the same day, they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They encamped in the wilderness before the mountain, and there Moses went up to God. the Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. The covenant God offered at Sinai was like a marriage proposal, tender and solemn. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The people answered with one voice, All that the Lord has spoken we will do. God instructed Moses to consecrate the people for 3 days, having them wash their garments and prepare themselves for a divine encounter unlike anything that had ever occurred. On the 3rd day, when the morning came, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain and called Moses to the top. From the midst of fire and cloud, smoke and thunder, came the voice of God speaking the 10 Commandments' 10 principles that would become the foundation of moral law for all humanity. Each commandment fell like a perfectly carved stone, solid and enduring, designed to create a society built on reverence for God and respect for fellow human beings. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The voice began, establishing the basis for all that would follow. The commandments that followed were both simple and profound: to worship God alone, to avoid idolatry, to honor God's name, to remember the Sabbath, to honor parents, and to refrain from murder, adultery, theft, false witness, and covetousness. The people stood at a distance, trembling with fear and awe, their bodies quivering as though even the ground beneath them shared in their terror. The thunder of God's voice still echoed in their ears, and the sight of the smoking mountain, wrapped in cloud and fire, remained before their eyes like an unshakable memory. They said to Moses, their voices hushed and uncertain, You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die. The weight of divine majesty pressed upon them with such intensity that their hearts faltered at the thought of hearing the Almighty directly. Moses, however, lifted his voice to steady them, reassuring them that God had not come to destroy but to test, that his holy presence was meant to keep their hearts reverent and their hands clean, that his fear might guard them against sin. And while the multitude shrank back, Moses alone drew near to the thick darkness where God was, stepping into the cloud that veiled glory, becoming the chosen mediator between the blazing holiness of God and the trembling, uncertain people who dared not approach. What followed from that fearful encounter were not merely scattered commands, but a covenantal charter for a nation still in its infancy. Laws covering every aspect of life, civil statutes, ceremonial ordinances, moral imperatives, and social regulations. It was as though heaven itself laid down a foundation for a people who until recently had been slaves, unformed and restless, without land, throne, or law. Now, by divine decree, order was given to their chaos, justice to their wanderings, and identity to their fragile existence. These laws were not burdens, but blessings, guardrails meant to protect and shape a people chosen to reflect God's holiness among the nations. Property rights, worship practices, the treatment of servants, the care of the poor-nothing was too lofty or too ordinary to escape the gaze of the Lord. The altar law came first, teaching them that worship must never be a performance of pride, but an act of humility. Altars were to be made of earth or of unhewn stones, raw, untouched by human tools, unadorned with boastful skill. Upon these altars, sacrifices would be offered not to exalt human craftsmanship, but to lift up humble hearts before their Maker. Then followed instructions concerning Hebrew servants, violence and injury, property damage, and restitution. Each law breathed a wisdom that bound justice with mercy, balancing the rights of the individual with the needs of the community. Boundaries were drawn around the sanctity of life and relationships. Prohibitions against kidnapping, against dishonoring father and mother, against sorcery and witchcraft, against unnatural practices that defiled creation itself. And within these boundaries was the famous principle, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, a phrase so often misunderstood. It was not an invitation to blood vengeance, but a safeguard against excess, a holy restraint that kept punishment proportionate to crime, curbing the endless spirals of retaliation that plagued the ancient world. Special concern was directed toward the vulnerable, the widows, the orphans, and the sojourners who lived among them. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, God declared, for you yourselves were sojourners in the land of Egypt. The memory of their own tears, their own chains, their own groans beneath Egyptian taskmasters was to be transformed into compassion, becoming the very foundation of their justice. Mercy was no longer optional. It was enshrined as law. The rhythm of creation itself was mirrored in their life. The sabbatical year was instituted, a holy seventh year when the land itself would rest. The soil, weary from constant labor, would lie fallow, and what grew by itself would belong not to the rich, but to the poor, the stranger, and even the wild beasts of the field. Thus, the earth was drawn into the covenant, learning to breathe in harmony with its Creator's order. The calendar, too, was woven into divine memory. 3 times a year, every man was to appear before the Lord at sacred feasts. At the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they would remember their deliverance from Egypt, the night when haste and unleavened bread marked the dawn of freedom. At the Feast of Harvest, they would celebrate the bounty of God's provision, rejoicing in the first fruits of the land. And at the Feast of Ingathering, when the year drew to its close, they would acknowledge with gratitude that every blessing had come from the hand of the Lord. These festivals would not merely fill their days with ritual, but stitch the story of God's faithfulness into the very fabric of time itself. Meanwhile, Moses ascended deeper into the cloud, remaining on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. There, he received not only the moral law engraved in stone, but also the intricate blueprint for worship. Detailed instructions for building a tabernacle, a portable sanctuary where the God of heaven would dwell among his people. The thought was staggering that the King of the universe, who cannot be contained by heavens themselves, would condescend to travel with nomads in a tent of meeting. Yet such was the paradox of grace. Transcendence wrapped in immanence, eternity dwelling within time. Every detail of the tabernacle was marked with precision and beauty. The materials gold, silver, and bronze, blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, fine linen, goat hair, ram skins dyed red, and sea cow hides, acacia wood, and olive oil. Each chosen not only for durability, but for symbolic depth. Gold for glory, silver for redemption, bronze for judgment, colors that reflected heaven's majesty and earth's richness, all pointing to divine mysteries yet to be unveiled. At the heart of this sacred design stood the Ark of the Covenant, the most holy vessel. Fashioned of acacia wood and overlaid with pure gold, it would house the tablets of stone upon which God's own finger had written his covenant. Above it rested the mercy seat, a slab of pure gold flanked by 2 golden cherubim whose wings stretched outward, overshadowing the place where God himself would meet with Moses and speak. It was both throne and footstool, judgment and mercy, holiness and grace bound together. Beside it stood the table for the bread of the presence, bearing 12 loaves to symbolize the 12 tribes ever before the Lord's face. The golden lampstand, shaped like a flowering tree, held 7 lamps that burned without ceasing, casting perpetual light in the holy place, as if to echo the stars that God had set in the heavens. The altar of incense, placed before the veil, sent up fragrant smoke morning and evening, a continual reminder of prayers ascending to the throne of heaven. The structure of the tabernacle itself was layered with meaning. Frames of acacia wood overlaid with gold stood upon silver bases, covered by 4 protective layers, linen embroidered with cherubim, goat hair woven thick, ram skins dyed red, and the durable hides of sea cows. It was a sanctuary both exquisite and enduring, able to withstand desert journeys while reflecting the grandeur of the one who dwelt within. Around it stretched the courtyard, bordered by linen curtains hung upon bronze pillars. At the entrance stood the bronze altar for burnt offerings, where morning and evening sacrifices would be laid upon the flames. Between the altar and the tent stood the bronze basin, fashioned from the mirrors of the women who served at the tabernacle entrance. An act of holy transformation, turning vanity into sanctification. The priesthood was established with Aaron and his sons set apart for sacred duty. Their garments were to be for glory and for beauty. The ephod woven with gold, blue, purple, and scarlet threads. The breastpiece inlaid with 12 precious stones, each bearing the engraved name of a tribe. The robe with its hem adorned with pomegranates and bells. The turban with its golden plate inscribed, "Holy to the Lord." Every stitch testified to holiness. Every gem reflected divine light. Every bell proclaimed the beauty of consecrated service. The ordination ceremony was solemn and rich with meaning. Washing with water, clothing with sacred garments, anointing with oil, the offering of sacrifices all signified the setting apart of men for holy service. blood upon ear, thumb and toe marked them as wholly devoted, ears tuned to God's word, hands consecrated to his work, feet walking in his ways. Daily sacrifices were commanded, a lamb each morning and evening, grain offerings and drink offerings poured out, a rhythm of worship that sanctified time itself. The fire upon the altar was never to be extinguished, a perpetual flame ascending to heaven, a symbol of unending devotion. The half-shekel census tax ensured equality in the worship of God, rich and poor alike, contributing to the service of the tabernacle. The anointing oil, blended from costly spices, consecrated the furnishings, while the incense, made of rare ingredients, produced a fragrance found nowhere else, reserved solely for the worship of the Holy One. Even as construction plans were given, the Sabbath was emphasized again. Above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations. Work, however sacred, was never to eclipse the divine rhythm of rest. The Sabbath remained the covenantal sign, a reminder that it was God, not their labor, who sanctified them. When at last Moses had received all these words, God placed into his hands 2 tablets of testimony, tablets of stone written not by human hands, but by the very finger of God. Yet while the mountain blazed with holiness above, the camp below simmered with impatience. Days stretched into weeks, and the people, their faith faltering, began to wonder if Moses would ever return. Their trust, so radiant at the Red Sea, flickered dimly now beneath the weight of delay. Up, make us gods who shall go before us, they said to Aaron. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. The request revealed how quickly the human heart can forget divine miracles when faced with uncertainty and delay. Aaron, perhaps hoping to buy time or perhaps succumbing to pressure, asked for their golden earrings. He took the gold from their hands and fashioned it with a graving tool into a golden calf, similar to the bull gods they had known in Egypt. The people proclaimed, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." And Aaron built an altar before it, declaring a feast to the Lord. The irony was tragic and piercing. While God himself was giving Moses detailed and holy instructions for the building of his dwelling place among them, describing with precision the tabernacle where his glory would abide, the people in the valley below were already creating for themselves a substitute, a false god fashioned by their own hands. Their impatience grew into rebellion, and what should have been a season of waiting upon the Lord turned into reckless indulgence. They rose early the next day with eagerness, not to seek the God who had parted the Red Sea, but to bow before an image of their own making. They offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before it, then sat down to eat and drink in excess, rising up to play in wild abandon. The worship of the golden calf carried none of the solemn reverence that true worship demands. Instead, it was a carnival of unrestrained passion, a celebration marked by excess, indulgence, and a forgetting of the very God who had saved them. On the mountain, where divine fire still burned and the glory of God surrounded him, the Lord interrupted his holy instructions to Moses with words that struck like thunder. "Go down at once, for your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves." The shift in pronouns was chilling. No longer my people, but your people, as though the Lord, in his righteous anger, was disowning them. He told Moses of their swift turning aside, of how quickly they had forsaken the covenant, and he declared his intent to destroy them in judgment, erasing their name from history and raising from Moses alone a new nation that would bear his promises. But Moses, though standing in the radiant presence of God, did not think of himself or the glory such an offer could bring. Instead, he interceded for the people with words that revealed the heart of a shepherd willing to lay himself down for his flock. "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you yourself brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians mock, saying, 'It was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth'? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people." Moses pleaded not on the basis of Israel's worthiness, for they had none, but upon the basis of God's own covenant faithfulness. He reminded the Lord of the promises sworn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, promises sealed by God's own oath. "Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, 'I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.'" In that moment, the intercession of one man stood between a nation and utter destruction, and the Lord, in his mercy, relented from the disaster he had spoken. Intercession had moved the hand of judgment, showing that prayer offered in true faith can alter the course of history. Yet even as Moses descended the mountain, carrying in his hands the 2 tablets of the covenant, tablets written by the very finger of God, his heart grew heavy, for he knew what awaited below. When he drew near the camp, the noise reached him, not the sound of war, not the cries of lamentation, but the laughter and music of revelry. As his eyes beheld the golden calf and the dancing around it, his anger burned hot within him. With a holy fury, he hurled the tablets from his hands, and they shattered at the foot of the mountain. The breaking of those stones was more than a physical act. It was the visible sign that the covenant itself had been broken by Israel's unfaithfulness before it had even been established. Moses did not stop there. He seized the idol, cast it into the fire, ground it into powder, scattered it upon the water, and forced the people to drink it. What they had worshipped as precious became bitter in their mouths, a lesson etched into their senses that false gods always end in disappointment and bitterness. Turning to Aaron, Moses confronted him, but Aaron's reply was weak and evasive. "You know how prone these people are to evil. They said to me, 'Make us gods.' So I told them, 'Let any who have gold take it off.' They gave it to me, I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." His excuses revealed both fear and folly, showing how easily even leaders can bend when they lack courage to stand firm. But judgment could not be delayed. A plague struck swiftly, and then Moses stood at the gate of the camp and cried out with thunderous clarity, Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me. The sons of Levi rallied to him, choosing loyalty to God above family ties. With solemn resolve, they took their swords and went back and forth through the camp, striking down those who persisted in rebellion. About 3,000 men fell that day, and Moses declared to the Levites, "Today you have been ordained for the service of the Lord, each one at the cost of his son and brother, that he may bestow a blessing upon you this day." It was a sobering consecration loyalty sealed in blood. The following day, Moses climbed once more into the presence of God, bearing the burden of his people's guilt. His prayer was one of the most moving intercessions in all Scripture. Alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold. But now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. It was the cry of a leader willing to lay down his own eternal destiny for the salvation of those he led. Yet God answered with solemn truth. Substitution of one sinner for another could not cleanse guilt. Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. But now go, lead the people to the place I have spoken to you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them. Mercy would preserve them, but justice would not be denied. The relationship between God and Israel was wounded, though not destroyed. He would still lead them toward the promised land, but his nearness would not be the same. "I will not go up among you," he declared, "lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." This word fell on the people like a weight of sorrow. When they heard it, they mourned deeply, stripping off their ornaments in grief, recognizing that the greatest loss was not land or blessing or victory, but the absence of God himself in their midst. So Moses took the tent and pitched it outside the camp, far from the center of their dwelling, and called it the tent of meeting. It was both a judgment and a mercy. Anyone who sought the Lord would now have to go outside the camp, leaving behind the comfort of the crowd to seek him in humility. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, the people would rise, standing at the doors of their own tents, and watch in reverent silence until Moses entered. There, face to face as a man speaks to his friend, the Lord would meet with him while the nation stood in awe, reminded daily of the fragile mercy that still held them together. When Moses entered the tent, a hush would fall upon the camp, for the people knew that something holy was about to take place. Then, before their eyes, the pillar of cloud would slowly descend, heavy with mystery, and come to rest at the entrance of the tent. There it would remain, unmoving and steadfast, like a sentinel of heaven. In that sacred moment, the Lord himself spoke with Moses. The sight alone filled the hearts of the Israelites with awe and trembling. Men, women, and children would rise from their places and bow low, each at the entrance of his own tent, worshiping the God who dwelt in their midst. To them, the cloud was a veil of glory. To Moses, it was an opening into the presence of the Eternal. Thus the Lord spoke to him face to face, as a man speaks with his friend, with words that carried both tenderness and authority, weight and wonder. Within the intimacy of that tent, Moses poured out his soul. He pleaded for the restoration of God's favor, knowing that without the Lord's presence, their journey through the wilderness would be empty and hopeless. He cried out, "If I have found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I may know you more deeply, that I may walk in the light of your favor. Remember also, Lord, that this nation is your people, chosen and set apart for your name." God's response was not distant or cold, but filled with assurance. "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." These words were not only for Moses, but for every weary heart in Israel, a promise that God himself would be their guide, their shelter, and their peace. Yet Moses, carried by a holy boldness and a hunger that nothing on earth could satisfy, pressed further still. He longed not merely for guidance or blessing, but for the very essence of God himself. "Please," he pleaded, "show me your glory." This request was daring, for Moses had already seen wonders no other mortal had beheld, plagues that shook Egypt, waters parted at the sea, bread fallen from heaven, and still he yearned for more, for a deeper unveiling of the divine. God's answer revealed both his generous heart and the mystery that protects frail humanity. "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. But you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." The Creator of heaven and earth was willing to draw near, yet he set a boundary to preserve the life of his servant. So the Lord placed Moses in the cleft of the rock, a narrow shelter carved by his own hand in the mountain. Covering him with his hand, God shielded his servant from the full blaze of unapproachable glory. Then the moment came. God passed by, proclaiming his own name, unveiling his character with words that would echo throughout all generations. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children, to the third and the fourth generation. In those words was a revelation of divine nature, mercy and justice entwined, grace overflowing, yet holiness unyielding. Moses could do nothing but bow. With his face to the earth he worshipped, trembling under the weight of the revelation. Once more he interceded for the people, confessing their stubbornness, yet pleading for God's mercy. "If I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, let the Lord go in the midst of us, though we are a stiff-necked people. Pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us as your inheritance." And God, in his kindness, agreed. The covenant would be renewed, not only in word but in deed, with promises of wonders greater than any the nations had ever witnessed. Yet these promises came with solemn warnings. The land ahead was filled with snares, foreign gods, enticing alliances, the lure of compromise. The people were called to vigilance, to guard their devotion and remain distinct as God's chosen. Once again, Moses ascended the mountain, where he remained 40 days and 40 nights. Without bread or water, he dwelt in the sustaining presence of the Lord. During that time, God inscribed anew upon tablets of stone the 10 Commandments, words of covenant and life. When Moses descended holding the tablets, the people beheld something extraordinary. His face was radiant, shining with a light not of this world, for he had spoken with God. Aaron and the people shrank back in fear, unable to draw near to the brightness that rested upon him. Only when Moses called to them did they approach, and afterward he placed a veil over his face, concealing the glory. Yet whenever he went in to speak with the Lord, he removed the veil, standing unveiled before the one who gave light. Then began the building of the tabernacle, the dwelling place of God among his people. Moses gathered the assembly and declared, "This is what the Lord has commanded. From among you, take a contribution to the Lord. Whoever is of a willing and generous heart, let him bring an offering." The people responded with astonishing zeal. Men and women, young and old, brought gold and silver, fine linen and precious stones, wood and oil. Their generosity overflowed until there was more than enough for the holy work. The camp buzzed with life as offerings were gathered, and hearts were stirred with joy. For this was not mere construction, but worship expressed in skill and sacrifice. Bezalel and Oholiab, craftsmen filled with the Spirit of God, oversaw the work. Their hands, guided by divine wisdom, fashioned the holy furnishings. Curtains were woven with threads of blue, purple, and scarlet. Boards were shaped with exactness, and metals were hammered with artistry. Every detail was attended with reverence, for this was no ordinary project, but the creation of a sanctuary where heaven would meet earth. The labor of many hands rose like a song, each note contributing to a greater harmony of obedience and beauty. At last, the tabernacle was finished. Moses examined every piece, every joint, every ornament, and saw that all had been done precisely as the Lord commanded. His blessing rested on the people, simple yet rich. So Moses blessed them. For the tabernacle was more than wood and fabric. It was a testimony of transformed hearts, a visible sign that God had made his dwelling among them. On the first day of the first month of the second year, the work reached its climax. With solemn care, Moses erected the tabernacle. He set its bases, raised its frames, fitted its bars, and placed its coverings. He brought in the ark, covering it with the veil, set the table with the bread of the presence, kindled the lamps, and burned fragrant incense upon the golden altar. At the entrance, he placed the bronze altar, offering sacrifices as ordained. The basin was set between altar and tent, where Moses, Aaron, and his sons washed their hands and feet in purity. Around all, the court was established with its screen, enclosing the sanctuary as holy ground. Then came the moment of divine confirmation. When Moses completed the work, the cloud that had so often guided them descended once more. But now it filled the tabernacle entirely. The glory of the Lord entered and saturated the place until Moses himself could not step inside. So overwhelming was the presence. Day after day, the cloud hovered above by day, and fire burned within it by night, visible to all of Israel. Wherever the cloud lifted, the people journeyed onward. Whenever it remained, they waited. Thus the Lord himself became their compass, their protector, and their ever-present guide throughout all their wilderness years. The wilderness years that followed would test their faith in ways they could never have imagined. stretching their endurance and exposing the deepest places of their hearts. It was not a season of days or months, but of decades, a slow, unrelenting passage of time. 40 long years would unfold like a vast, winding river, sometimes gentle and calm, sometimes swollen and violent, carrying away one entire generation and patiently nurturing another in its place. Those who had once walked out of Egypt with shouts of triumph and songs of freedom would learn, often painfully, that the journey to the promised land was not simply about crossing miles of barren ground. It was a journey of the soul, a pilgrimage of transformation. The slow, patient, sometimes severe work of God shaping a people who had been slaves into a nation capable of bearing His name with dignity, holiness, and strength. In the wilderness, every day became a lesson in dependence. Each morning, when the dew evaporated, they found manna spread across the ground like a delicate gift from heaven, reminding them that life itself came from the hand of God. They would eat and be satisfied, yet always know that tomorrow's bread could only come from Him again. They learned to trust His timing, watching the movement of the mysterious cloud that rested over the tabernacle. When the cloud lifted, they packed up their lives and marched. When the cloud settled, they made camp, whether in fertile valleys or barren deserts. Their rhythm of life was not governed by their own desire, but by the presence of the Lord who dwelled among them. And when they grumbled or rebelled, when they grew weary of waiting or longed for the leeks and onions of Egypt, they discovered that disobedience carried a heavy cost. Yet even then, when repentance came, mercy followed. The same God who judged them also restored them. The older generation, the very ones who had witnessed the plagues in Egypt, who had seen the Red Sea split apart, who had walked through walls of water on dry ground, would never set foot in the land flowing with milk and honey. They had believed enough to leave Egypt, but not enough to enter Canaan. Their fear, their doubt, their unwillingness to trust God fully became their undoing. One by one, their lives ended in the wilderness, their graves marking the sands of a temporary home that would never become permanent. But their children, born into freedom, raised beneath the desert sky, nurtured on stories of God's faithfulness and daily sustained by His provision, these would become the heirs of the promises sworn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Through all those years, one thing never changed. The tabernacle stood at the heart of their camp. It was more than a tent. It was a declaration that the Holy One was near. Every morning and every evening, the smoke of sacrifices curled upward like prayers rising to the heavens. Priests, robed in sacred garments, tended the golden lamps so that their light never went out. They burned incense that filled the air with fragrance, reminding the people that God welcomed their worship. The sacred rituals, repeated day after day, wove invisible threads that kept the nation connected to their Maker. The law given at Sinai became their compass and their guide. It was spoken, written, memorized, sung, and enacted. Parents taught their children the stories of their ancestors, recited the meaning of the festivals, and impressed upon them the weight of justice, the necessity of mercy, and the beauty of holiness. Around campfires under starlit skies, Children listened with wide eyes as elders retold how God had parted the sea, thundered from the mountain, and fed them in the desert. From the youngest to the oldest, they were reminded again and again, "You are chosen, you are set apart, you are called to be a light among the nations." But the wilderness was no gentle tutor. It was harsh, unforgiving, and often merciless. There were rebellions when prideful men rose against Moses and Aaron, demanding power for themselves, only to be swallowed by the earth. There were plagues that swept through the camp when the people turned away from God's commands. There were wars with hostile tribes, sudden raids that tested their courage, shortages of water that drove them to desperation, and long marches that left their feet blistered and their hearts weary. Venomous serpents struck down the careless, diseases claimed the frail, and funerals became a constant reminder that life in the wilderness was fragile. The desert became both graveyard and classroom, a place where faith was refined in fire and unbelief was buried in sand. And yet, despite every failure, God's faithfulness never wavered. The cloud never abandoned them by day. The pillar of fire never deserted them by night. The manna did not cease. Water flowed even from the rock when needed. Victories came when they fought in His name. His presence shielded them from annihilation. His law directed their steps, and His promises kept hope alive even when the horizon seemed endless. In time, Joshua emerged as the one chosen to lead after Moses. A warrior with sword in hand, yet also a servant with faith in his heart, Joshua embodied courage rooted in trust. Caleb, too, stood as a testimony of endurance, his body strong and his spirit unbroken, a living reminder that steadfastness brings reward. And so, a new generation arose, a people who had never known the whip of Egyptian taskmasters, who had never felt the chains of slavery on their wrists. They were free from birth, hardened by wilderness trials, and ready to claim what their parents had feared to take. Moses, the lawgiver, the prophet, the liberator, would not cross with them. From the heights of Mount Nebo, he gazed upon the land of promise spread before him, green valleys and fertile hills rolling beneath the sun. But his feet would never touch it. His journey would end there, his body laid to rest by the very hand of God in a hidden place in Moab. Yet his legacy would outlive him. He would be remembered as the prophet who spoke with God face to face, the leader who stretched out his staff over the sea, the shepherd who bore a stubborn people on his shoulders and led them to the edge of destiny. And so, the story continued, as it always had since the day Abraham heard the call to leave his father's house and follow the unseen God. Generations would come and go, but the promises made to the patriarchs stood firm. They pointed not merely to Canaan, not merely to cities and vineyards, but to something greater still, the arrival of one who would be more than a prophet, more than a priest, more than a king. He would embody in himself all the shadows and symbols of the tabernacle. He would be the perfect sacrifice that ended all sacrifices, the eternal mediator who bridged heaven and earth, the true bread from heaven that satisfied forever, the fulfillment of every word God had spoken. For now, in the gentle darkness of this telling, Let these ancient truths settle into your heart like seeds planted in good soil. The God who called Abraham, who wrestled with Jacob, who spoke to Moses from the burning bush, who split the sea and shook the mountain, who dwelt in the tabernacle and led his people through the wilderness. This same God continues his faithful work in every age, calling people to leave the familiar and follow him into the unknown territories of faith.